Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is, well, we'll say it is Friday. It's Friday now. Hooray. We made it to Friday, November 28th, 2025. We are post-Thanksgiving, or at least you are post-Thanksgiving. I am pre-Thanksgiving, talking to you as if I were also post-Thanksgiving. You get the idea. It's a very busy day here at Kagro in the Morning World Headquarters this Friday, and just going to have to be away from the microphone during normal broadcast hours. But I had a couple of stories that I really wanted to share with you. One, I could not find time to shoehorn in at any point, but was just important for many reasons, but not a story of the moment. But it also turns out, after doing the recording, I did not plan it this way, but it turns out that I spent the rest of the show, pretty much all of the rest of the show, on trying to get up to speed on what's going on with respect to this supposed peace deal that the U.S. may or may not have written and may or may not have proposed to settle things between Russia and Russia, essentially. Ukraine is only incidentally involved in this picture, but I became interested in, why it was that we couldn't understand what the official American position was on authorship of this thing. I couldn't understand why it was that we were negotiating this deal with a person who was personally under sanctions. I couldn't understand how it was that a person who was under sanctions was getting through immigration controls into this country to negotiate with the president's son-in-law and, of course, the special envoy. And I couldn't understand why it was that Witkoff, who appeared to have just essentially nothing going on mentally with any of this, was so excited to essentially carry forward the Russian wish list and say that it was a peace plan. And as it turns out, it's just what it appears to be. He has no diplomatic experience. He's dealing on the Russian side also with somebody who has no diplomatic experience, but who I guess is getting guidance from people who do have diplomatic experience, and then finally making it all the way through the transcript of the phone call that was included in the write-up in Bloomberg that Greg mentioned the other day. That really just revealed, I thought I was going to be opening up a transcript that was going to be, it took me an hour to read. It was like a 5-minute phone call, and Witkoff, it's like talking to a kid. I just can't understand it. Anyway, I thought I would share all that with you. And as it turns out, it ended up eating up the bulk of the show, which is just fine, because I was wondering at the outset, what else am I going to include in today's show to round it out? I thought about maybe I will do just an hour, but there's so much news. And this was just a great day to do like a long form look at a pretty confounding problem. But first, I want to kick things off with a story that could easily be evergreen, but really needs to get on your radar right away. So I'm going to roll that, and then we'll go straight into the Russia story. And hey, then there'll be time to play the music and see you on the other side. Here's a story I wanted to share with you that I guess I don't know if there's any appropriate or really good time to bring up a story like this, but in case you were not disappointed enough, in case you were not disgusted enough by the Trump administration, I thought I would add this story by Lauren Gill over at boltsmag.org, which I guess brings up a problem that we probably should have foreseen it. We should have seen it coming, but it just doesn't really enter your mind in a situation like this. This is really something. Death row prisoners granted clemency by Biden, not pardons, not to be released from jail, but clemency on their death sentences. That is to say, converting them to probably life without possibility of parole. But just to take the death penalty off the table, death row prisoners granted clemency by Biden brace for, quote, living hell under Trump. How about this for a subheader to explain what's going on? Trump officials are retaliating against people who were granted clemency. That's not against Biden, against the people who were granted clemency. Retaliating by imposing the harshest conditions in the entire federal prison system, including near total isolation. Wow. It just doesn't even really enter your mind that any president would go back and looking for opportunities to ruin the lives worse. Or, I mean, they're pretty ruined as it is, but to make life worse for people who were just granted presidential clemency. You just don't think about this happening, and I guess someone really should. Although what you do with it, there's nothing to be done. President Biden wasn't going to grant pardons to these guys. It was important to him that they continue to recognize that they need to serve their sentences, but just taking death penalty off the table, this is really incredible. Inside the federal supermax tucked away in Colorado's high desert, prisoners spend 22 to 24 hours a day locked alone inside concrete cells that are smaller than a standard parking space. The prison, formerly called United States Penitentiary Florence Administrative Maximum Facility, but better known as ADX, has earned the nickname the Alcatraz of the Rockies because of its harsh conditions, which of course will only make Trump enjoy it even more. Alcatraz, ooh, I love the word. Contact with others is extremely limited. Programming, such as anger management or religious services, is broadcast over televisions in the cells, while psychological evaluations happen through the steel doors. Belongings are also strictly limited, and prisoners aren't allowed to hang photographs or drawings on their walls. Exercise time out of the cell happens alone inside large cages called dog runs, where prisoners can only walk a few paces in each direction. Prisoners are given virtual reality goggles to simulate the outdoors or community. A former warden once called ADX a clean version of hell and said that living there was far much worse than death. Olympic Park bomber Eric Robert Rudolph and Rami Youssef, mastermind of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, are both incarcerated at ADX. In February, Rejon Taylor learned he would be sent there. As one of the 37 people on federal death row whose death sentence was commuted to life without the possibility of parole by then-President Joe Biden before he left office, Taylor had been anticipating a transfer away from the prison in Terre Haute, Indiana, that houses the federal death chamber. He hadn't considered he would be sent to ADX, which according to the Federal Bureau of Prisons guideline is reserved for people, quote, who have demonstrated an inability to function in a less restrictive environment without being a threat to others, unquote. Taylor, by contrast, had a clean disciplinary record and had earned a job as an orderly in Terre Haute, which gave him freedom to move around the unit during work. While he was allowed more than 8 hours for phone calls every month, ADX would limit him to 4 15-minute phone calls a month. At ADX, I see myself being locked in my cell virtually all day, he told Bolts. When I'm not in my cell, I see myself alone at rec. I picture myself cut off from the outside world. Biden's decision to grant Taylor and his fellow prisoners clemency left only 3 people on federal death row and effectively blocked Trump from repeating the unprecedented spree of executions he oversaw during his first term. Trump renounced the move in a Christmas Day post on his social media platform, Truth Social, telling the prisoners to, quote, all caps, go to hell. Trump issued an executive order on his first day in office that called for an expansion of the death penalty and maligned officials who have been critical of capital punishment. The order directed the Attorney General to review the placement of all 37 people whose death sentences were commuted by Biden and to ensure that these offenders are imprisoned consistent with the monstrosity, that's the word, monstrosity of their crimes and the threats they pose. In early February, The day U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi was sworn in, she ordered her staff to follow through on Trump's order and evaluate the placement of Biden's clemency recipients. Lawyers for a group of the 21 out of the 37 prisoners, or I don't know whether the first "the" belongs there. Lawyers for a group of 21 out of the 37 filed a federal lawsuit against the Trump administration in April, alleging that it engaged in a sham process to imprison Biden's clemency recipients in the most oppressive conditions in the entire federal prison system. They argue that the government violated prisoners' due process rights and their protections against cruel and unusual punishment because the prison is unequipped to handle their medical and mental health problems and will exacerbate their conditions. The lawyers have said that Trump's plan is vindictive and serves no legitimate penological purpose. 8 prisoners who are not part of the lawsuit were already moved to ADX in late September. A judge has yet to rule on a temporary restraining order that would block the transfer of Taylor and the remaining prisoners who could still be moved to the federal supermax any day. While the restrictions pale in comparison to ADX, Taylor still lives in a form of solitary confinement on death row in Terre Haute. At least he's been afforded some privileges and is able to leave his cell and interact with other people every day. After Biden commuted his death sentence, Taylor figured that officials would first transfer him to a high-security penitentiary in Florida, where he planned on applying for a spot in a restorative justice program back in the general population at Terre Haute. With fewer restrictions than on federal death row, he was looking forward to finally hugging his family members again after 17 years. However, at ADX, his visits would continue to be non-contact and happen through thick glass. Now, with the prospect of being put in an even deeper form of isolation, Taylor says he wishes he was never granted clemency to begin with. Some men here are grateful that they are alive, that they no longer have the threat of execution looming before them, and so they feel like the worst is behind them, he told Bolts. Then there are some like me who feel that death feels closer after clemency, that the worst is ahead of us at ADX, where we will exist in conditions of monstrosity, in a living hell. To decide where prisoners should be placed, BOP staff undergo a process that's enshrined in federal law that stipulates people should be placed within 500 miles of their home, dependent on factors such as bed availability, medical and mental health needs, or programming requirements. Prisoners are placed into one of 5 levels of security threats, ranging from minimum to administrative, using a database that calculates criteria such as their age, criminal history, and history of violence or escapes. On January 7th, lawyers representing the prisoners who were leaving death row met with a BOP attorney about how the Bureau would determine where to place their clients following their commutations. The attorney told them that each prisoner would be considered individually and invited their counsel to submit information to assist in the process, such as the location of family members they might be placed close to. According to Gerald King, a federal public defender who wrote an affidavit recounting the meeting as part of the ongoing lawsuit. King said that he met again with the lawyer a week later and was told that his client, Richard Tipton, would be transferred to a high-security penitentiary. If he did well, he would then be moved to a medium-security facility. King said he followed up with an email to the lawyer asking that Tipton be transferred closer to his family in New York. Then, after Trump issued his executive order on January 20th, the BOP lawyer told King that they were in a, quote, holding pattern because of it, according to King's affidavit. On February 18th, the BOP lawyer told King that his client would be transferred to ADX. Tipton, I thought it was Tipton. Yes, there's a missing T here. Tipton had received a notice stating that he was being moved there because he posed a risk to others and couldn't safely be housed elsewhere. The BOP has a special process for confining prisoners to ADX. It includes a hearing. When Tipton had his hearing on April 7th, he learned within hours that he was approved for ADX. In an email to Bolts, Taylor described the hearing that he attended virtually via WebEx that same day about his referral to ADX. He said The hearing administrator asked if he was suicidal, to which he replied that he was not. When the administrator asked if he would be suicidal if he moved to ADX, Taylor said he replied, "I don't know, but what I do know is this. If I were placed in ADX and my communications with the outside world were restricted, it would adversely impact me. My connection to the outside world is my lifeline, my source of strength, my motivation for survival." They proceeded to talk about his family, and Taylor told him that he wanted to give back his commutation. 2 hours later, he said he received his recommendation for ADX. To further justify the move, the BOP had assigned Taylor and some prisoners to the Security Threat Group, denoting a group, gang, or organization promoting violence, escape, drug, or terrorist activity of death row inmate, even though they were no longer on death row. So, okay, that's interesting. Some prisoners to the Security Threat Group death row inmate. So they'd just been granted clemency from death row, but that's how they classify them. The recommendations gave the same reasons for sending most of the prisoners to ADX, regardless of whether they had clean disciplinary records, medical or mental health needs, or had participated in extensive programming. In most cases, these determinations were received by prisoners within hours of their hearing, which suggests that they didn't get much of a hearing, obviously. Taylor said he reviewed hearing reports for several other prisoners, finding that they were riddled with inaccuracies. In one, the administrator appeared to have mixed up the testimony of two prisoners. The assignments seemed to contradict BOP policy, which stipulates that prisoners must be considered for other high-security prisons before being designated to ADX. In April, after Taylor and other clemency recipients received notice that BOP officials had approved their placement at ADX, lawyers with the ACLU filed a lawsuit seeking to block their transfer. Gary Moore, who oversaw Ohio's death row as director of the state's corrections department and served as president of the American Correctional Association, told Boltz that the Trump administration's plan contradicts basic corrections policy, which since the 1990s, he says, has been to impose the least restrictive environment necessary to maintain custody and security of the individual. I can't see a rational reason to move inmates that have been compliant in an environment to a more restrictive environment, Moore said. That's contrary to my correctional understanding of fundamental policy. Lawyers for the U.S. Department of Justice have defended the move, saying that there was nothing wrong with the process Bondi engaged in to send the prisoners to ADX. In a September statement to Fox News following the transfer of 8 prisoners, Bondi said the move, quote, will ensure that they spend the remainder of their lives in conditions consistent with the egregious crimes they committed. And that's unquote. 10 of the prisoners that officials want to transfer to ADX have serious mental health conditions, which their lawyers say will be exacerbated by the near total isolation of the conditions there. Some have already made numerous suicide attempts. Craig Haney, a psychology professor at the University of California, Santa Cruz, who has visited ADX and conducted research on solitary confinement for decades, wrote in a declaration as part of the prisoner's lawsuit, quote, mentally ill people are more likely to deteriorate and decompensate when they are subjected to the harshness and stress of prison isolation. The harm is so pronounced that in 2012, the American Psychiatric Association issued guidance that in most cases, prisoners with serious mental illness should not be subjected to solitary confinement for more than 4 weeks because they are especially vulnerable to the impact of prolonged isolation. While BOP said that ADX is equipped to handle prisoners with a higher need of care, lawyers representing the clemency recipients with serious mental illnesses argue that they will not receive appropriate treatment there. As Biden's clemency recipients brace for being sent to ADX, Robert Dunham, director of the Death Penalty Policy Project, said he thinks the courts will ultimately block the transfers. You cannot select individuals for partial treatment, he told Boltz. You cannot put a thumb on the treat them badly side of the scale because their sentences were commuted. That's called retaliation, and that's unconstitutional. There is some precedent of courts intervening during reassignments of former death row prisoners to harsh conditions. After Connecticut abolished the death penalty in 2015, prisoners were confined to conditions worse than the general population, including limited recreation time and communication with others. The scheme was ultimately ruled unconstitutional following a lawsuit from one of the prisoners. Taylor said that he's grappling with anxiety stemming from the possibility of being confined in ADX's harsh conditions. In an essay he wrote for Solitary Watch in September, he recounted the suicide attempt of a fellow prisoner who was also awaiting a transfer. "We are men marked for retribution, targeted for extrajudicial punishment," Taylor wrote. "A sense of doom hovers ahead as I anticipate being buried alive at ADX." Taylor has kept himself busy on death row by writing and making art. He also receives weekly visits and speaks on the phone almost daily. "My connection to the outside world is my lifeline," he told Bolts. "To sever my lifeline is to undermine my sanity, my stability, my sense of security. And I fear what that might do to me. I fear becoming a mere shell of my once social self. I fear that kind of social death. I fear I won't make it out alive." Well, I can tell you, I know there's a lot of people that believe that they should certainly get the harshest punishment, and certainly people who believe in capital punishment. And remember also that there were a couple of people on death row that Biden didn't commute the sentences for, that he really thought that was an appropriate sentence, or that they were just too controversial to do that to for whatever reason. But, and I think Dylan Roof comes to mind in that case. But, this idea that, I mean, for some of these guys, I don't even know whether they were making any actual active applications for clemency. But just generally speaking, a president, outgoing president who believes that the death penalty just ought not to be used that frequently, grants clemency to people. And then you take it out on the prisoners themselves because you can't get at the former president. It's just one of those things you got to live with, man. Forget about it. But no, Donald Trump wants to hurt as many people, preferably powerless people, as possible. I just found that really shocking, and we haven't heard much about it. And I thought I know. Well, now you have something to be thankful for around Thanksgiving time. This isn't happening to you or hopefully anyone you know. So I feel it might be wise for us to spend a little bit of time, since we have it, are forcing ourselves to have it, to catch up with the so-called peace plan story and why it's so-called and who's paying to whom. It was all a little bit convoluted, and it was all we could do to get a handle on the situation by looking at what Empty Wheel was handing us, that Marco Rubio was perhaps the only honest broker in explaining that this so-called peace plan had not, in fact, come from the United States. Not officially, anyway, although now it's beginning to look like, to the extent that it did come from the United States or was passed up the chain of command within the United States, that it came through Steve Witkoff. The only problem is that everybody views Steve Witkoff as the willing dupe of the Russians, which I guess explains why so much of the document allegedly reads as though it was translated from the Russian and is so one-sided in its proposal of what's supposed to be, after all, a peace plan. And I thought that maybe the best entree into that was to take all that for granted and then jump right into sort of a high-level consideration of how this thing happened and why it was troublesome. But then as I was reading it, I got to thinking that perhaps maybe the best thing to do was to do a little bit of backgrounder on who is the Russian party involved in all this and what's he like, and then some of the official reporting on how the peace plan got kicked around within the circles that are supposed to be writing it as well as accepting it, and then onto that high-level consideration of exactly what might be going on here. So I'm going to start this way, because the main Russian player in all of this appears to be Kirill Dmitriev, whose name we've heard before and we keep hearing over and over, and is one of the real puzzlements in all of this, because one of the things that struck me when I was taking a look at his role in all of this was that they kept mentioning that he was a sanctioned person, but they were also mentioning that he was going back and forth to Miami to meet with Steve Witkoff, but also Jared Kushner. And I got to thinking, well, one, what is it that he's sanctioned for in particular, but also if you're a sanctioned person, I mean, if you're a legal person, but you're from the wrong kind of country, you can't get in and they won't let you in through the airports. Now, assume he's flying on God knows what kind of private or even diplomatic transportation. But I was just sort of curious, how is it that a sanctioned person keeps moving at will back and forth to Miami, of all places? And the answer is in one of these articles they mentioned, that just casually mentioned, that the Trump administration has given him a special waiver to do this, which, you know, if it was for a legitimate peace plan to actually settle an international conflict like this, I could understand. But since it's really not, what are you doing giving this special waiver to a person who is under sanctions by the United States? They won't let, you know, honest people who just want to work hard and provide for their families get into the country. What are they doing letting this guy in and out? And the answer is he's connected to Putin and he's rich in his own right. So, and he's in a position to give some of those riches to Donald Trump and the people Donald Trump likes. So I guess that's really it. But all right, here's the rundown from The Guardian on who Kirill Dmitriev actually is. We're depending on the writing of Pyotr Sauer. I don't know whether he makes us call him Pyotr or we can just say Peter. Again, I guess they're Russia correspondent over at The Guardian. The headline, Kirill Dmitriev, ruthlessly ambitious Kremlin figure behind Ukraine plan. So I'd like to find out a little bit more about him. This is a publication from last Friday, the 21st of November, and gives us a pretty good backgrounder. The subheader tells us where we need to start on him. Harvard-educated head of Russia's wealth fund has risen to key role despite having little diplomatic experience. So I don't know whether I would necessarily have counted on the guy from Russia to have diplomatic experience. You might think, on the one hand, yeah, you want to send somebody who's an experienced diplomat to deal with Steve Witkoff because he'll be able to run circles around him. On the other hand, you might also say, well, if your instructions are coming from the top, who cares? And maybe someone like Steve Witkoff, who has no diplomatic experience, will feel more comfortable with someone like Kirill Dmitriev, who also doesn't have diplomatic experience, especially given that they've met before. So here's the profile. When relations between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin soured this autumn, with the U.S. president publicly accusing Moscow of blocking a path to peace in Ukraine and announcing significant sanctions against Russia's oil sector, one man saw an opening. Kirill Dmitriev, the U.S.-savvy, Harvard-educated head of Russia's sovereign wealth fund, boarded a plane to Florida late October, where he met with Steve Witkoff, the property developer serving as Trump's freelance envoy on Ukraine. All by itself. The two men, neither of whom has any real diplomatic experience, began drafting a plan that would impose draconian terms on Ukraine and hand Moscow sweeping influence over the country's political and military sovereignty. It sounds like the sort of thing that Ukraine might not actually be interested in, right? But they're not at the table. The scheme, which surfaced in media reports on Wednesday, has thrust Dmitriev back into the global spotlight, a position several people who have met him over the years say he has long craved. Dmitriev is obsessed with being perceived as important, said one source, who has known him since the Moscow business scene in the late 2000s. He is ruthlessly ambitious, the source added, describing him as very thin on substance, but exceptionally good at selling himself. That does sound familiar, doesn't it? The source, like others, asked for anonymity so they could speak freely. Fake it till you make it, was Dmitriev's modus operandi, the source said, and he has, objectively, made it very far. It may come as a surprise to some that one of Moscow's most aggressive champions was born in Soviet-era Ukraine. The son of a prominent scientist, or several prominent scientists, i.e. two prominent scientists. Dmitriev grew up and studied at Kiev's elite Lyceum number 145, a competitive maths and physics school, where he made an impression on friends as a hardworking pupil who was obsessed with the U.S. That's how you know you're reading The Guardian. They were multiple maths. Not the way we say it. Anyway, he was quite arrogant, but very systematic. And if he wanted to achieve something, he worked on that. Well, that's good old-fashioned hard work, I guess. That, according to Vladimir Ariev, who was in the same year as Dmitriev and is now a Ukrainian MP. At 15, Dmitriev was selected by his school for a trip to the U.S., an experience that, according to Ariev, solidified his fascination with the country. He later enrolled at Stanford University, followed by an MBA course at Harvard. In a 2000 New York Times story about Harvard's business school, Dmitriev marveled at the opportunities that came with his new course. There's a great sense of bonding with your teammates. You live together, go out at night to celebrate victories or drown sorrows, Dmitriev says. He also foreshadowed his own ambition and knack for making connections. I also go to New York for business development, to establish strategic alliances, and meet with clients 4 times a month. After stints at McKinsey and Goldman Sachs, his real business breakthrough came not in Moscow or New York, but in Kyiv. By the way, just going back to that previous paragraph, did I understand that one correctly? He went to Stanford, then he went on to Harvard, which is, of course, in Boston, in Cambridge. But he also goes to New York for business development and establish strategic alliances and meet with clients 4 times a month, which is an awful lot. But is he saying that he would go back and forth between Boston and New York all the time for clients? And I guess if you're in a Harvard MBA program, it's entirely possible you might actually have clients. But if not, well, I'm just sort of interested in how that came to be. After stints at McKinsey and Goldman Sachs, where he would have clients, his real business breakthrough came not in Moscow or New York, but in Kyiv. From 2007 to 2011, he ran Icon Private Equity, a Ukrainian fund managing roughly $1 billion, most of it belonging to the oligarch Viktor Pinchuk, the son-in-law of the former Ukrainian president Leonid Kuchma. I don't know how I'm doing on my Ukrainian pronunciation of names, but we soldier on. Pinchuk introduced him to Vladimir Dmitriev, no relation to him, not Kirill Dmitriev's relative then. And then the head of the Russian State Development Corporation, VEB. That's what Vladimir Dmitriev was. Not that this was another person that he met later on, but all right, same guy. That, according to a well-connected source in Moscow who has direct knowledge of the events. Together, the two Dmitrievs persuaded the Kremlin to launch Russia's Foreign Investment Fund, known as RDIF, that would lure American, European, and Gulf capital into Russia. The role, eventually overseeing $10 billion, seemed to suit him perfectly, said a Russian business reporter who knew Dmitriev personally. The smooth-talking Dmitriev became a fixture in Davos, Riyadh, and at global investor summits, gliding from panels on artificial intelligence to discreet bilateral meetings with sovereign funds. It was also around this time that Dmitriev's personal connections to the Kremlin thickened. His wife, Natalia Popova, I'm hoping I've got our pronunciation and emphasis correct, developed a close personal and professional relationship with Putin's younger daughter, Katerina Tikhonova, or Tikhonova. I'm still not sure how they do this. Anyway, Popova remains the deputy director of Inopraktika, Tikhonova's research institute. An investigation by the Russian outlet The Insider also alleged close links between Dmitriev and Russia's security services. He grew extremely confident, even pompous, said the source who knew Dmitriev at the time. Sanctions imposed on Russia after the 2014 annexation of Crimea made it harder for Dmitriev to sell Moscow abroad, but he sensed an opening with Trump's first election in 2016. One former RDIF colleague said Dmitriev swiftly ordered the fund to release a statement the morning after Trump's win, signaling support for the incoming president. Robert Mueller's report on Russian 2016 U.S. election meddling found that Dmitriev tapped his UAE network, drawn from one of the RDIF's principal investors, to build a back channel to Trump's first administration. After Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Dmitriev was placed under sanctions by Washington, I guess personally. But Trump's return to power handed him another lifeline. Dmitriev quickly began signaling to the White House that there was money to be made in any eventual peace deal. Touting the prospect of multi-billion-dollar contracts in the Arctic and other areas of U.S.-Russia cooperation, a potent pitch for a business-obsessed administration. He set out specifically to cultivate a relationship with Witkoff, Trump's trusted friend and longtime business associate, leaning heavily on the property mogul's enthusiasm for deal-making. Oh, we have sound effects for that. I don't want to miss out on my chance to do that, although I'm recording in a different spot, which makes everything just a little bit more awkward to get to those things on time. But all right, we like leaning heavily on the property mogul's enthusiasm, or enthusiasms, as the case may be, for deal-making or, money stealing. Together, the two men helped arrange the release of the U.S. schoolteacher Mark Fogel in a prisoner swap in February, a gesture they framed as an early step toward repairing relations between Washington and Moscow. But this guy is under sanctions. He is. But he keeps getting waivers to make business deals, I guess. But Dmitriev has not limited himself to Witkoff. Much of his public activity now appears focused on courting other prominent MAGA figures, amplifying the U.S. far-right's talking points. Oh, and amplifying them. Okay, he's into amplifying them. A fervent user of X, he posts daily about Europe's migration, quote, crisis, accuses, quote, globalists of indoctrinating children with, quote, pro-trans programs, and regularly promotes conspiratorial rhetoric, once even adding a QAnon-style slogan popular with Trump's most extreme base. Dmitriev's Ukrainian background has not stood in the way of his rise. At 15, he told a local journalist during his trip to the U.S. that Ukraine had a long and proud history of independence, and that rising nationalist sentiment would help break the power of the communist system. But he has since become one of the Kremlin's most loyal advocates. Dmitriev chose Putin's side, said Ariev, the Ukrainian MP, adding that most childhood friends had long since broken contact with him. Dmitriev's closest school friend became a soldier in the Ukrainian army and was wounded in battle recently, Ariev added. The source, who knew Dmitriev in Moscow in the 2010s, said he almost never spoke about his place of birth. He had no real interest in Ukraine. His attention was always on Moscow, they said. Still, despite his fierce loyalty to Putin, Dmitriev's meteoric rise has ruffled feathers within Russia's aging foreign policy establishment. One source close to the Kremlin said that they had offered to help Dmitriev with outreach to the Americans, and with drafting a potential pathway to end the war in Ukraine. Assistance Dmitriev flatly declined. He could really use some advice on foreign relations, because he himself admitted to me that he isn't an expert on this, but he decided to go at it alone, the source said. Dmitriev's relationship with Sergei Lavrov, the long-serving foreign minister, is also notoriously poor, just as Witkoff's apparently is poor with Marco Rubio. All right. Where did we leave off? Oh, yes, right. Notoriously poor relationship with Lavrov. The rift between them is now an open secret in Moscow, and has occasionally burst into the open. Lavrov and Dmitriev clashed last February, bringing peace talks in Riyadh with the U.S. when the foreign minister tried to exclude him by removing the chair set out for him, according to... I feel like we missed a word here somewhere. Lavrov and Dmitriev clashed during peace talks in Riyadh with the U.S. when the foreign minister tried to exclude him by removing the chair. Okay, set out for him. According to two people who separately described the episode, Dmitriev ultimately joined the meeting after a call with Putin. Oh, so he calls back home and goes over Lavrov's head. All right, and that works. That's interesting. Dmitriev has made enemies in Russia, but right now he is untouchable because he is proving to be very useful for Putin, said the source close to the Kremlin. All right, so that gives us an idea of who is Dmitriev, where does he come from, how is he regarded inside Russia, how is he regarded by American counterparts as well. And I think that'll all become very important. And then I'd like to move on from there to a brief reading of, we'll see how brief it is, a reading of a Reuters piece that moves us into the current situation, which is Trump officials meeting with Russian in Miami spurs questions about Ukraine proposal. This is Aaron Banco and Graham Slattery writing again for Reuters a day later, November 22nd. And this is what they've got to add to the picture. U.S. officials and lawmakers are increasingly concerned about a meeting last month in which representatives of the Trump administration met with Kirill Dmitriev, a Russian envoy who is under U.S. sanctions, to draft a plan to end the war in Ukraine, according to multiple sources familiar with the matter. The meeting took place in Miami at the end of October and included Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, President Donald Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner, and Dmitriev, who leads the Russian Direct Investment Fund, RDIF, right? Remember that? One of Russia's largest sovereign wealth funds. A close ally of Russian President Vladimir Putin, Dmitriev has taken a leading role in talks with the U.S. about the war and has met with Witkoff several times this year. The Trump administration issued a special waiver to allow his entry, a senior U.S. official told Reuters. There's the reference to the answer to the question there. Next section, meeting resulted in controversial Ukraine peace plan. Dmitriev and his fund were blacklisted by the U.S. government in 2022 following Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The sanctions effectively bar American citizens and companies from dealing with them. The meeting resulted in a 28-point plan for ending the war, two people familiar with the situation said. The plan, which was made public this week by Axios, came as a surprise to U.S. officials in various corners of the administration and has stirred confusion at embassies throughout Washington and in European capitals. But just to reemphasize that one point that I wanted to make sure everyone saw was all of this is going on under a waiver of the sanctions against this guy. The previous administration said it's bad news to find yourself dealing with this Dmitriev guy. Don't do it. The Trump administration says, let's actually make sure that any peace deals between Russia and Ukraine, or let's say a peace deal regarding Ukraine that is worked out between the United States and Russia, that this guy is an integral part of it. And we're going to just waive those sanctions right in the middle of a big immigration crisis. All right. Well, back to the story. It has also prompted criticism from the Ukrainians and their allies for appearing heavily tilted toward Russian interests, with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky vowing on Friday that he would not betray Ukraine's interests. The document, which calls for major concessions from Ukraine, appears to run counter to the tougher stance the Trump administration has lately taken toward Moscow, including with sanctions on its energy sector. It is unclear whether Dmitriev came to the meeting in Miami with certain Russian demands or whether those were incorporated into the peace plan. Two people familiar with the meeting said Rustem Umerov, it's U-M-E-R-O-V, Umerov perhaps, unless it's Umerov. I guess they'd put a Y in it if it was Umerov. Rustem Umerov, Secretary of Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council, was also in Miami earlier this week to discuss the plan with Witkoff. Thank you. Gee whiz, thanks for granting him an audience. One source familiar with the situation said Witkoff told Umerov about the plan during that visit, and that the United States gave the plan to Ukraine via the Turkish government on Wednesday before directly presenting it to Kyiv on Thursday. I don't know what the idea was supposed to be there, but maybe I guess you could, during a legitimate administration, I suppose, using back channels to see whether you're going to get positive feedback when you launch the thing, hard launch it. the next day might be a normal course of action. But I have my doubts about it, the way it's working with these guys, who have no diplomatic experience, after all. Next up, plan seeks best win-win, White House says. Umerov has described his role as technical and denied that he discussed the plan in substance with U.S. officials. He did not respond to a request for comment. Witkoff, Kushner, Dmitriev, and the Ukrainian embassy in Washington also did not respond to requests for comment. White House spokeswoman Caroline Leavitt said in a statement that any peace plan, quote, must offer security guarantees and deterrence for Ukraine, Europe, and Russia, and offer economic incentives to both Ukraine and Russia. This plan was crafted to reflect the realities of the situation and to find the best win-win scenario where both parties gain more than they must give, she said. I mean, it's a nice thing to say. I don't know if it bears any resemblance to reality, but fine. Trump said on Friday that he expected Zelensky to sign on to the plan by Thursday's Thanksgiving holiday. So I suppose at this point we should know already whether they've decided to sign on, and I think that they have not. The U.S. has warned Ukraine it could curb military assistance if it does not sign, Reuters has reported. So, you're free to do whatever you want. We're just threatening you if you don't. In an address on Friday night, Zelensky announced talks with Ukraine's partners on steps to end the war. Our representatives know how to protect Ukraine's national interests and what exactly is needed to prevent Russia from carrying out a third invasion, another blow to Ukraine, he said. Trump said on Saturday the proposal was not his final offer, signaling potential room for adjustments as Ukraine and its European allies stressed that the plan could serve as a foundation for negotiations, but required significant changes. Next section is some officials caught off guard. This is what we heard about just the other day. Many senior officials inside the State Department, which is amazing, and on the National Security Council, also amazing, were not briefed. The two people familiar with the plan said. Special Envoy for Ukraine Keith Kellogg, who had been working with the Ukrainians on negotiating an end to the war and plans to step down in January, by the way, was also cut out of the talks led by Witkoff and Dmitriev, they said. One senior U.S. official said Secretary of State Marco Rubio was read in on the 28-point plan, but did not clarify when he was briefed. Secretary Rubio has been closely involved throughout the entire process of developing a plan to end the war in Ukraine. Any insinuation otherwise is completely false, says who? State Department Principal Deputy Spokesperson Tommy Pigott in a prepared statement. That includes speaking with both sides of this conflict many times to facilitate the ellipsis. I don't know why. Exchange of ideas to establish a durable peace. Some U.S. officials and others consulted by Reuters disputed that characterization, with one official saying the plan contains material that the Secretary of State has previously rejected. The situation has sparked worries inside the administration and on Capitol Hill that Witkoff and Kushner skirted the interagency process and that the discussions with Dmitriev have resulted in a plan that favors Russian interests. It includes demands that Russia has previously made, that Ukraine give up some of its territory in the eastern part of the country that it still controls, recognize Crimea as Russian, and pledge not to join NATO. This so-called peace plan has real problems, and I am highly skeptical it will achieve peace, said Senator Roger Wicker of Mississippi, the Republican chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee. Ukraine should not be forced to give up its lands to one of the world's most flagrant war criminals in Vladimir Putin. Senator Mike Rounds, a Republican, told reporters at a conference in Halifax, Nova Scotia on Saturday that Rubio had called him and other senators to suggest that the plan was delivered by Russia to the U.S. and sent on to Ukraine. It is not our recommendation. It's not our plan, Rounds said. But Rubio later posted on social media that the proposal was authored by Washington. It is based on input from the Russian side, Rubio wrote on X, but it is also based on previous and ongoing input from Ukraine. So, sounds like it wasn't, but they needed to say that it was. Concerns about Dmitriev is the next section. I figured where this was going. The administration's discussions with Dmitriev have also worried some inside the intelligence community, a U.S. official familiar with the matter said. Dmitriev has previously used his role at RDIF, the Sovereign Wealth Fund, to make inroads with various Western governments and businesses, even amid American sanctions. The CIA declined to comment about concerns within the intelligence community about Dmitriev. During the first Trump administration, Dmitriev established contacts with the president's team to reset relations between Washington and Moscow, to no good end, I'm sure. In a 2017 meeting with Eric Prince, the former CEO of Blackwater and a Trump ally, Dmitriev discussed U.S.-Russia relations, according to the Department of Justice report published by Special Counsel Robert Mueller in 2019. Mueller's team was investigating ties between the Trump team and Russia, of course. The meeting, which took place in the Seychelles, was one of the initial points of contact between Russia and the U.S. after Trump took office. Prince did not immediately respond to a request for comment. In a separate meeting with a friend of Kushner's, Dmitriev drafted a reconciliation plan to strengthen ties between the U.S. and Russia, the report says. The Mueller team said in its report that it did not establish that the Trump campaign coordinated with the Russians to influence the 2016 election. Dmitriev also worked directly with Kushner during the first administration. During the pandemic, Dmitriev coordinated with Kushner on the delivery of ventilators to the U.S. The ventilators were provided by RDIF and caused concern among officials at the Treasury Department that the U.S. might be violating its own sanctions, according to a senior U.S. official. Of course, that would have been delightful for Putin to say, all right, well, if you'd rather stick by your sanctions, we won't give you the ventilators that you need so badly. It would be a great place to make trouble for him. And I guess he did. All right. Did we read this paragraph already? Yes. In recent years, Dmitriev has appeared on various American television stations and at events such as the World Economic Forum in Davos to promote the strengthening of trade ties between the U.S. and Russia. He pushed a similar message at the meeting in Miami, according to public readouts of the meeting. His visit also included a sit-down with U.S. Representative Anna Luna. Remember her? Yes, Anna Paulina Luna, we usually say. A Florida Republican. In the meeting, Dmitriev and Luna spoke about increasing trade ties between the U.S. and Russia. Luna's office did not respond to a request for comment. The meeting between the two was set earlier in the month amid statements by Luna that she had received Russia's files on assassinated U.S. President John F. Kennedy. Oh, boy. Yeah, that's so interesting. In a video by RIA, one of Russia's state news agencies, Luna is seen accepting a box of chocolates with Putin's face inscribed on the front. It's a poor image, if you ask me. The images appear to show Luna and Dmitriev in a conference room at the Faena Hotel in Miami. I don't know this hotel. Faena. The Faena Hotel is owned by Access Industries, a company run by Len Blavatnik. According to the company's website, Blavatnik, who was born in Ukraine and is a dual U.S.-British national, initially earned his money partnering with Viktor Vekelsberg, a Russian billionaire sanctioned by the U.S. for his ties to Putin. Blavatnik, we definitely remember that name, fully divested from all Russian assets following Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine, allegedly, according to his spokesperson. Witkoff's company, the Witkoff Group, another clever name, does business with Blavatnik, including in Miami. All right. So now we've got that basic report from American mass media about concerns about the deal that was struck between the two. And then, of course, we learned, and it was reiterated in this, it was unclear what the provenance of this so-called deal really was. So lastly, I thought I might add this piece, a more in-depth look at the machinations, I think, behind the scenes from Michael Weiss, who writes the Foreign Office Substack. He is a writer, editor, and author of a forthcoming history of the GRU. So a little bit more into the, military intelligence. Is GRU military intelligence or the civilian intelligence? Well, I can't remember which one's which, but certainly Russian intelligence operations appear to be his specialty. And this piece is titled in a quote, the quote being, "He must have got this from K." And K, we're given to understand, is Kirill Dmitriev. Who says it and to whom and why? I guess that's meant to, to be the question we go in with. How a Russian operative used the American media to force a risible peace deal, quote unquote peace deal, in fact, into existence. What exactly is this? This too, from the same time period, November 21st. Starts off with a little bit of a lesson for us here that might become interesting. Here's how I mean it. Concepts from Soviet military and intelligence doctrine have a bad habit of degenerating into American buzzwords, if not cliches, especially in the age of Trump. Disinformation, which has a very specific meaning and is a powerful and relevant tool in the right hands, has, through overuse and politicization, come to mean in the American popular imagination something like news I don't like, dismissing everything. Like fake news, the way Trump uses fake news, I would say, or facts inconvenient for ideologues on the other side. Slightly less familiar, but still sometimes circulated by people who want to sound sophisticated. We all do. When talking about foreign plots of deception or destabilization, which often include the use of disinformation, is the term active measures. Definitely heard that one. Much less vogue is a concept Americans deserve to be more familiar with because they're victims of it all the time. Reflexive control. Don't think I know that one. This is the psychological trick by which the Russians get their enemies to allow the Russians to do their thinking for them at their own expense. Reading the news in the last 48 hours is a very good example of this theory put into practice. Axios's Barak Ravid and Dave Lawler reported that the Trump administration was drafting a 28-point plan modeled on its Gaza peace deal to end the war in Ukraine. The plan, per the outlet, fell into 4 broad categories: peace in Ukraine, security guarantees, security in Europe, why is that different, and future U.S. relations with U.S. and Ukraine. The main drafter on the American side was Steve Witkoff, Trump's special envoy, while his counterpart on the Russian side was Kirill Dmitriev, the head of the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund and a hyperkinetic operative, who seems to understand the American political and media establishment better than most Russians do. Attributed to anonymous U.S. and Russian officials, the story quoted only one person on the record who told Ravid and Lawler many things, including some that were demonstrably untrue. I'm thinking back to the end of that last paragraph. Remember why it is that Dmitriev is said to have a better understanding of the American political and media establishment than most other Russians. And the answer is some extensive American education, right? Stanford, trip to the U.S. as a student when he was 15 years old, undergraduate work at Stanford, and then graduate work at Harvard later on. So, pretty extensive exposure to the U.S. systems here. The Russian position is really being heard in this whole deal, Dmitriev said. I had to add in this whole deal because I've come back to the paragraph in the middle here. The Russian position is really being heard, Dmitriev said, adding that what was up for discussion was a much broader framework, basically saying, how do we really bring, finally, lasting security to Europe, not just Ukraine? This proposal was taking place, Dmitriev noted, against the backdrop of recent Russian battlefield gains. He claimed to have worked out the preliminary details with Witkoff after 3 days huddled with the Bronx developer in Miami last month. In reality, it says parenthetically, Dmitriev had only a few hours with Witkoff in Florida, and left the United States rather ingloriously, having been denounced as an ignorable propagandist by U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent on CBS's Face the Nation. Oh, well, that's different. And we learned earlier that's going to be like particularly annoying and insulting to Dmitriev, to be called ignorable. Ravid caused quite a kerfuffle internationally, as he no doubt intended to do. What he did not count on was that one of his most frequent sources, Witkoff, would undermine this exclusive by getting away trade secrets. It's what it says. Probably giving away trade secrets. The envoy accidentally tweeted under Ravid's story what looked to be an intended direct message to a third party. I'm not sure who, but the note was, he must have got this from K. Witkoff tweets to some other person a link to Ravid's article in Axios saying he must have got this from K. Well, Michael Weiss, the writer here, says, I saw the tweet and screenshot of it before Witkoff, realizing his technical whoops, deleted it. K, I assumed, referred to Kirill, the only on-the-record source for Ravid's story, an unintended disclosure by Witkoff, another frequent source for Ravid's stories, that the Russian was preemptively selling something he didn't yet own, having worked out how American media is a helpmeet to politics. More interesting was that Dmitriev's freelancing was not being met with unmixed delight by a fatuous and impressionable U.S. diplomat. I'm going to have to untangle that. Let's read on. Within hours, there was more reporting and greater kerfuffling. The Financial Times confirmed such a 28-point plan, and some of the grimmer details. Ukraine would have to cede to Russia the remainder of Donbass, previously deemed a non-starter by Kyiv and certified as such by a map-tossing Trump. It says mapping tossing, but a map-tossing Trump who tried to sell that plan to Zelensky when the Ukrainian president was last in Washington. It would have to cut the size of its standing army in half, Ukraine would. It would have to forfeit certain weapons systems, especially long-range missiles that can reach Russia, and reduce its dependency on U.S. security assistance. Also, no foreign troops would be allowed on Ukrainian soil. The Russian language and Russian Orthodox Church would also have been guaranteed status by Kyiv. All of these provisions, needless to add, are long-standing maximalist Russian demands, which the U.S. has previously rejected, most recently after Secretary of State Marco Rubio's fruitless discussions with Sergei Lavrov as the preliminary for the now scotched Budapest summit between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. I didn't realize that was canceled. There was no mention of what Ukraine would get from this grand bargain, which seemed to be the point of emphasis in all the leaks. It was a Russian wish list. NBC News and the Wall Street Journal both noted that while Witkoff may have been driving the car, he had co-passengers. The plan, now described as a blueprint for ending the war, was worked out by Rubio, Witkoff, and Jared Kushner, according to the Journal, citing unnamed U.S. officials. NBC reported that the president this week approved all 28 points. I'm sure he didn't look at any of them, citing one unnamed senior administration official. What struck me about this whole affair was that for such a multi-authored month-long project, no one from the American side was willing to go on the record to talk about it. Everything was on background comment, except for Dmitriev, who was only too happy to gibber. Moreover, the State Department was silent. All journalist inquiries directed at Foggy Bottom were not even redirected to the White House, which is highly abnormal on matters of foreign policy sensitivity. Then, late Wednesday night, Rubio, under his personal account, tweeted this: "Ending a complex and deadly war such as the one in Ukraine requires an extensive exchange of serious and realistic ideas, and achieving a durable peace will require both sides to agree to difficult but necessary concessions. That is why we are and will continue to develop, we'll continue to try to develop, I don't know, a list of potential ideas for ending this war based on input from both sides of this conflict. I think this was the same quote that bothered us the other day. To anyone on nodding terms with diplomatese, this sounded like the whir of the backpedal, Rubio's way of trying to downplay expectations created by Dmitriev and Axios and the resulting press frenzy. An extensive exchange of serious and realistic ideas was not, after all, a signed, sealed, and delivered plan of action, which Politico's Dasha Burns had described, citing a senior White House official, as a fait accompli, cobbled together without the input or consent of Brussels. We don't really care about the Europeans, said that same senior White House official, even though the EU and NATO will have an outsized say in determining the future of Ukraine and Europe, from sanctions relief to security assistance. Only a week ago, Rubio said at the G7 that Russia isn't interested in peace, and Ukraine cannot cede the rest of Donetsk to Moscow. Now he was meant to be an architect of exactly that, albeit a reluctant one, judging from the tone of his voice. Although he always looks kind of crestfallen these days. It looks like he has no input whatsoever. For hours on November 19th, there was not a word from any White House official about this 28-point deal said to be blessed on high in the White House, an oddity considering the framing of it as a shakedown of Ukraine and all over but the shoutin'. There were further oddities to the policymaking, both substantive and optical. And by the way, I had to say shoutin' because it was I-N apostrophe. He's forcing that pronunciation. Now, let's start with the substantive. This deal landed smack dab in a news cycle where all developments indicated that the U.S. was at least sticking to the status quo of arming Ukraine and aiding at least some of its war efforts with intelligence sharing and target selection. The State Department had just authorized the potential sale to Kyiv of $105 million in Patriot air defense sustainment. The Nordic and Baltic countries had just committed $500 million to the NATO Pearl mechanism, P-U-R-L, by which Europe buys what only America makes and donates it to Ukraine, while Poland kicked in $100 million. The UK had also recently resupplied Kyiv with Storm Shadow cruise missiles, which require U.S. technical assistance to be fired, a strong hint that the consignment must have been greenlit by Washington. The very day preceding the Axios, quote, scoop, Ukraine launched, I don't know how they say this, but ATACMS, ATACMS? That sounds like a likely acronym for it. ATACMS, ATACMS, into Russian territory, targeting the Pogonovo military training ground at Voronezh. Oh boy, they're going to give me all sorts of Russians to try to pronounce. And for the first time claimed credit for firing these long-range ballistic missiles inside Russia. U.S. General Alexis Grynkowicz, Grinch, G-R-Y-N-C-H, because Grynkowicz is G-R-Y-N-K-E-W-I-C-H, the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO and the head of U.S. European Command, will have okayed that salvo as the authority for allowing Ukrainian deep strikes using Western munitions now rests with him. Finally, the U.S. Treasury Department passed one critical early test of its sanctions regime against Russia by bigfooting Gunvor, a Swiss commodities trader used as Vladimir Putin's personal piggy bank, which had sought to purchase now-sanctioned Lukoil's assets. On November 6th, Treasury tweeted, President Trump has been clear that the war must end immediately. As long as Putin continues the senseless killings, the Kremlin's puppet, Gunvor, will never get a license to operate and profit. The optical oddities were even weirder. As this framework for peace in our time was breaking, Donald Trump was suspiciously silent. He'd spent 24 hours since the Axios dump ranting on Truth Social about Jimmy Kimmel, Jeffrey Epstein, and how he wanted to execute Democrats for telling soldiers to disobey illegal orders. Trump is not known for his judicious filtering of his thoughts and feelings on matters of great urgency, yet there was no heralding of another Nobel-worthy intervention. No thuggish threat to Zelensky that this was an offer he couldn't refuse. No sweet nothings to Vladimir for finally getting us to da, spelled in the Russian here. I had to look that over and say, oh, can I say this? Yeah, I think so. It's da. There was nothing. Senator Lindsey Graham, one of the few normie Republican Trump whisperers on the Hill, who was always used to launder the president's venality as being somehow magically in service of Ukraine, claimed to have absolutely no knowledge of any 28-point plan for ending the war. Graham would be the first senator to be instrumentalized by the White House to do the cable news circuit to sell any viable agreement. Even more bizarre was that only hours earlier he was telling everyone that Trump had authorized him to advance his dust-gathering legislation, co-sponsored with Senator Richard Blumenthal, for imposing 500% tariffs on countries importing Russian oil, gas, uranium, and petroleum products. Why even engage in a pantomime of more sanctions if you're about to hand Putin the keys to the kingdom? Moscow, for its part, was silent when it might have been giddy with excitement. Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, said the Russian government hadn't seen any new proposal, and last they knew, bilateral relations with the Trumpies got frozen in Alaska in August. What we do know comes only from media reports. There are some ideas coming from the American side, but nothing concrete has been discussed so far. Maria Zakharova, the Russian Foreign Ministry's spokeswoman, said much the same. The messaging from the Kremlin was that Dmitriev was off on his own adventure in the Sunshine State and everything was quite TBD. As for the American side, where was the robust comms strategy for hawking this thing? Where was the prepping of key stakeholders to lobby for lifting sanctions as part of any peace arrangement? Each U.S. government agency was behaving as if it were not only blindsided, but simply making things up as it went along, if not engaged in half-hearted firefighting to put out a blaze started by a Russian operative. The U.S. Embassy in Kyiv promoted on X a cringy State Department meme of Trump captioned, "We want to help our allies. We want to change our enemies." By all accounts, Ukraine, an ally, was about to be railroaded, and Russia, an enemy, was about to be left remarkably unchanged. U.S. European Command, the purview of the Grinch who just stole Mobik Christmas in Voronezh. All right, too many Russian references for me to even keep up with. I don't know what Mobik is. Well, Grinch here boosted the recent provision of Patriot missile systems via Germany, a tacit acknowledgement that Russia's airborne savagery was unrelenting. Was Trump really across the deal in all its details? It's an interesting construction, across the deal. What did his, quote, support for Witkoff amount to? Recall that the preliminaries for the doomed Anchorage summit consisted of Witkoff misinterpreting what the Russians were offering, easy enough to do when you rely on an SVR translator, and making it seem as if they'd conceded things they hadn't. This caused some dyspepsia in the Oval, and Trump later, quote, jokingly, dismissed Witkoff's ability to parley with the Russians. Could this be happening again? And could it be even worse now that Trump, distracted with his imploding MAGA coalition at home, a flush-worthy approval rating, a battering at the polls on November 4th, and bloodlust for the domestic opposition be too distracted? Could Trump be too distracted to care about the finer points of his big, beautiful peace deal for Ukraine? This guy's writing is getting too ornate to be able to follow it. Sure, Steve, sounds great. Keep going. Sounded like what amounted to the Trump seal of approval here, but we don't know because no one bothered to ask this question or at least have it answered. Furthermore, was the interagency process that governs all major and minor U.S. foreign policy making, much less the settlement of the largest land war in Europe since 1945, for which the U.S. has committed upwards of $180 billion, simply humming quietly along in the background? I emailed the White House press office the following question, specifically addressing Deputy Press Secretary Anna Kelly. All right. And it's a multi-parter here. One, of course it's a multi-parter. All the sentences are multi-parters. But first part of the question, it's been reported that Steve Witkoff worked on this plane for a month and has Trump's backing. It says plane. I assume he means plan, but I was wondering whether he was going to get around to, referring to it by the metaphor of landing this plane. I'm not sure, but I think it's plan. It's been reported that Witkoff's worked on this plan for a month and has Trump's backing. But what exactly is the president supporting here? The 28-point plan, as described in the media, is even more of a capitulation to Russia's maximalist demands than what was being floated months ago. It also mirrors a lot of what Sergei Lavrov apparently told Marco Rubio weeks ago, which led to the cancellation of the Budapest summit. Is the president actually aware of the details of this plan, or is he just generally supportive of Witkoff's efforts? The president has been silent on social media about this, and he is usually quite voluble about media chatter concerning his foreign policy. Part 2, there's a lot. Kirill Dmitriev is playing a large role in pushing for this agreement in the press. He was the only on-record source of the Axios story, which broke the news of the agreement. Is the White House worried the Russians, or at least this one Russian, are trying to will something inchoate and preliminary into existence by playing the U.S. press corps? I note that the Russian Foreign Ministry and presidential administration both deny any knowledge of this plan, and some Russian analysts we have queried are suggesting Dmitriev is freelancing. It's an important question, but there's no chance that this White House would understand it and much less be able to answer it. Part 3. Marco Rubio tweeted last night from his personal account what many diplomats are saying was a walkback of the press reports, citing the difficult and necessary concessions from both sides when only concessions from Ukraine have been reported. Why is Rubio distancing himself and the State Department from this plan if, as per NBC and Wall Street Journal, he was an integral shaper of it? Yesterday, State did not even redirect queries to the White House for comment, an unusual move. Part 4. Given that Europe is now the main funder of Ukraine and NATO allies are the ones who are buying American weapons and kit via Pearl, how is it that the Europeans were completely left out of these discussions? Is there any solution to this that does not include the parties subsidizing Ukraine's defense? All right, that's it for the question. Geez. The White House press office reply, attributable to a, quote, senior U.S. official who did not even identify himself, or rather did not identify who they were to me on background. So even on background, they wouldn't say who's answering. The answer is this. Special Envoy Witkoff has been quietly working on this plan for a month, receiving input from both the Ukrainians and the Russians on what terms are acceptable to them to end the war. Both sides will have to make concessions, not just Ukraine. The president has been briefed on this plan and supports it. I mean, you were never going to get an answer as detailed as that question ever was, but you also were just not likely to get an honest answer at all. Day 2 reporting was more illuminating and suggested expectations for this framework or blueprint or living document or draft plan, as others are calling it, were dropping faster than Russian oil exports. Both the New York Post and the Kyiv Post, two exceptions in the media landscape which bothered to interrogate the provenance and publicity of this proposal, cited U.S. sources affirming that, yes, Kirill Dmitriev did plant this story in Axios in order to shape the narrative in advance of any American diplomatic jockeying. The Kyiv Post's excellent Alex Ralfoglu, if I have that name anything close to correct, helpfully pointed out that his sources were people close to Witkoff, meaning that even Dim Philby understood he'd got done the dirty by his partner in crime in Moscow. I've lost this guy's thread entirely now with all of his inside references. The implication being that now Witkoff was racing to jam this thing down everyone's throat before they had the chance to scrutinize the contents. I mean, this is just not likely. I don't think you can make people do that. Politico now clarified that, quote, a number of people who would have normally been informed of such a plan at the White House and the State Department were also not consulted about Witkoff's renewed push, with one U.S. official saying there was, quote, zero interagency coordination. You don't say. The Wall Street Journal turned the dial down to room temperature, stating the U.S. hasn't settled on any specific blueprint and will continue to consult with the warring parties, which rather sounds as if a fait accompli was more like a work in progress. The main consultant with the Ukrainians was a fittingly strange choice for a strange series of developments. U.S. Army Secretary Dan Driscoll, a former classmate and friend of J.D. Vance, who was originally slated to go to Kyiv to discuss weapons procurement and drones and other fun stuff about which the U.S. military could learn a lot from studying Ukraine's innovations in these areas. Now Driscoll was being tasked to present Witkoff and Dmitriev's scheme to Zelensky, even though Driscoll has no background in statecraft or any known expertise in Russia and Ukraine. Interesting. But we did hear Greg mention all of these names in connection with this stuff. Then the 28-port plan started circulating in Ukrainian media and was verified to be the real document. On cursory glance, it was obvious why so many in the U.S. government had been kept from seeing it. It was every bit the Russian wish list that had been teased, but vague where it needed to be specific about Ukraine's rights, while very specific about Russia's entitlements. Moscow's stony posture suggests it knew Dmitriev had cooked up something too good to be true or taken seriously, both of which are true. Here are some of the lowlights with my comments. It is expected that Russia will not invade neighboring countries and NATO will not expand further. It is expected is language mushier than what is in the Budapest Memorandum, which previously locked both Russia and the United States into affirming Ukraine's sovereignty and providing it with security guarantees in exchange for its relinquishment of nuclear weapons, until one of the signatories invaded Ukraine twice. This particular phrase is passive construction, as The Guardian's Luke Harding observed, and it makes much more sense in the original Russian. I guess that was the wording that they were talking about being a tip-off that it had been written in Russian and translated. Passive voice. As to the security guarantees on offer now, let's take a look. From the document, the size of the Ukrainian armed forces will be limited to 600,000 personnel. Ukraine's armed forces, which currently stand at around 900,000 active duty and 1.3 million reservists, 2.2 million personnel total. It's unclear from the text if 600,000 refers only to active duty members or active duty plus reservists or active duty plus reservists and the National Guard. Without a clear definition of what personnel means, it's hard to make any determination, but if Ukraine were to cut its forces by upwards of 70%, it might make deterring unexpected Russian aggression in future all the more difficult. Next, Ukraine agrees to enshrine in its constitution that it will not join NATO, and NATO agrees to include in its statutes a provision that Ukraine will not be admitted in the future. NATO agrees not to station troops in Ukraine. What about that? Russia thus dictates not only the future size of the alliance and its deployments. Stationing NATO peacekeepers in Ukraine was an earlier proposal by Trump, but also dictates in perpetuity the will of all Ukrainians, even though their nation's sovereignty is confirmed in the first sentence of this document. Not very sovereign if they can't opt to join any organization they want to, really. European fighter jets will be stationed in Poland, is the next quote from the document. Ukraine just inked a deal with France to buy up to 100 Rafale, I don't know, RAFALE fighter jets, and earlier inked an MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, to explore purchasing between 100 and 150 Swedish Gripens, Gripens. Evidently, these are to be parked on NATO tarmacs, but Ukraine gets to land her American-made F-16s at home. Also, did anyone consult with Warsaw about their new bilateral responsibilities? This comment from Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk, still the Prime Minister there, would indicate not. If Ukraine launches a missile at Moscow or St. Petersburg without cause, the security guarantee will be deemed invalid. So, if Ukraine launches a missile at, say, Rostov or Belgorod or Nizhny Novgorod without cause, the security guarantee is still valid? What a nice way to signpost to Russians in the region that their lives are nothing in comparison with those of the elites living in the big cities. What else does it say? Crimea, Luhansk, and Donetsk will be recognized as de facto Russian, including by the United States. This runs counter to a host of U.S. legislation and executive orders, including those issued by Trump in his first term, which affirms Ukraine's territorial integrity, and it indeed vouchsafes to Putin the fortress territories of Donetsk his army is incapable of conquering. Also from the text, $100 billion in frozen Russian assets will be invested in U.S.-led efforts to rebuild and invest in Ukraine. The U.S. will receive 50% of the profits from this venture. Europe will add $100 billion to increase the amount of investment available for Ukraine's reconstruction. So, America is to receive kickbacks from Russia for the rebuilding of cities, towns, and villages pulverized by Russia, using frozen Russian money. And Europe, which has not been consulted on any of this, is to be made to spend more of its own money on Ukraine's reconstruction. I wonder if the head of Russia's sovereign wealth fund is reckoned with which of the Siloviki will be expropriated here. I don't know what that means. To the enrichment of the U.S. government. Russia will enshrine in its law a policy of non-aggression toward Europe and Ukraine. And it just gets LOL from Mike Weiss here. All civilian detainees and hostages will be returned, including children. That would be nice. Dmitriev acknowledging that Russia has taken children hostage in this war, the foundational war crime for which Putin was indicted by the International Criminal Court, is probably treasonous, but who cares? Next, this agreement will be legally binding. Its implementation will be monitored and guaranteed by the Peace Council headed by President Donald J. Trump. Oh, he's on the Peace Board in Gaza and the Peace Council for this thing, too. Sanctions will be imposed for violations. This is the Gaza deal redux, and one can easily see Jared Kushner's paw prints on it. But as Sir Lawrence Freedom, is that a real person, points out in his own extended annotation of the document, what happens when Trump is no longer president? Does the chairmanship of this Peace Council automatically pass to whomever replaces him? And what happens if that person turns out to be an internationalist Republican or Democrat with a better understanding of Russia? No, didn't think about any of that. Of course not. And that's because these guys have no experience. So maybe it does point to their having drafted the thing after all. Kushner seems to think Russia is Israel and Ukraine is Gaza, which is why Qatar, a Middle Eastern emirate that bribes its way to global relevance, got involved in a hemisphere that it has no business shaping. One can tell the Miami sound machine is panicking slightly because Kushner and Witkoff are now trying to dress up their deal as robust and good for Ukraine and have taken to laundering their amended version of a NATO-style security guarantee through, who else? Barak Ravid and Axios. This proposal bears not even a passing resemblance to Article 5, and it's all subject to the caprices of Trump, prospective chairman of the Ukraine-Russia Peace Council, who we're now invited to believe might go to war with Moscow if Moscow wages significant, deliberate, and sustained war with Kyiv, whatever that means. As of this writing, the Europeans are rallying to Zelensky's defense as he delivers a somber address to Ukraine, reminiscent of the eve of the full-scale invasion, saying that the real threat now isn't advancing Russian columns, but a difficult choice between dignity and losing the United States. Washington has apparently threatened to cut intelligence to Ukraine again if it doesn't sign on the dotted line by Thanksgiving, is it? NATO gets less than a week to determine its final membership status and force disposition. Poland gets a week to park its neighbor's jets in its hangar and cough up a cool $100 billion. Sounds eminently doable, even if the Russian government deems this plan not ready and Vladimir Putin isn't in the same hurry as Trump to end the war. On the other hand, what's the rush? The American president finally emerged from his hidey hole and told Fox News Radio's Brian Kilmeade, "I've had a lot of deadlines, but if things are working well, you tend to extend the deadlines. But Thursday is, we think, an appropriate time." All right, I get the point. Very hard, very difficult to believe that any of this has been thought through at all. Not so difficult to believe that they wrote this because they have no diplomatic experience and just generally no deal-making experience in this type of thing at all. And yeah, a close reading pretty much proves it. I think we actually managed to untangle what it was Michael Weiss was talking about. So the longer this goes on, the more obvious it becomes that this was a joke from the beginning. And yet, the ball is rolling. Axios says it's serious, and official Washington is supposed to follow along. And this would be obviously a fairly big disaster for the Ukrainians. Even a disaster, really even just answering by the ultimatum deadline of Thanksgiving is ridiculous. The setting it for Thanksgiving is ridiculous. That's when Trump intends to tune out. You should get me my answer by then. Sure. Not a serious proposal at any point. Well, this may be more than I was planning to do on this whole Ukraine deal, but it is a fairly important thing. But I'm looking again at the Bloomberg piece that Greg mentioned the other day. Witkoff advised Russia on how to pitch Ukraine plan to Trump. And we went over the basics of it, but I'm thinking now that the details of it, the quotes from it that are attributed to Witkoff really help drive home the unlikelihood of there ever having been anything serious and substantive behind all of this. And I thought I might read through it and maybe with the previous stories as context, this might help us understand things a little deeper. Again, Witkoff advised Russia on how to pitch Ukraine plan to Trump. This thing, I think, is unattributed and simply runs as Bloomberg news and no authorship given to this. I'm a little curious about that all by itself. But this seemed like an interesting addition to all these things and spurred a couple other thoughts. U.S. presidential envoy Steve Witkoff, fresh from the triumph, as they say, of the Gaza peace deal, held a phone call last month with a senior Kremlin official to suggest they work together on a similar plan for Ukraine and that Vladimir Putin should raise it with Donald Trump. In an October 14th phone call that lasted a little over 5 minutes, Witkoff advised Yuri Ushakov, Putin's top foreign policy aide, on how the Russian leader should broach the issue with Trump. His guidance included suggestions on setting up a Trump-Putin call before Volodymyr Zelensky's White House visit later that week and using the Gaza agreement as a way in. And so far, this has been sort of like sane washing the situation, explaining, giving some like logical framework to what he's doing. I will say I'm not entirely convinced that this doesn't happen ordinarily. I know it puts me in agreement with Trump's claim that this was a normal thing to do for Witkoff to have advised the Russians on how to sell this to Trump, in the sense that, I mean, if you care about the deal and you've negotiated the deal and you realize that there's going to be countervailing pressures in the mind of the president you're trying to pitch it to, you might give the other side some pointers in how they might break through in describing their view of the peace deal in ways that it will make the president tune in. But that's just if you have a president with other thoughts in their head. And the thinking is along the lines of, well, if you tell him that this will further his strategic goal of XYZ, he'll listen to you. I mean, that's as much cheating as anything else. But if the instructions are, well, just wave a gold brick in front of his face and tell him you'll give it to him like a dog treat and he'll go along with you, that's bad. We don't want that. I mean, even though that's fairly obvious at this point and there's no value to hearing it come from Witkoff. But, if you're also trying to flatter Witkoff in all of this, you just say, oh, yeah, your advice is really invaluable to us. Anyway, now I wanted to go on to the part of this where you get quotes from the call. And they do offer a full transcript of the call, which I think would be a more annoying thing to read, but might make the point even better than a few quotes from it. But the few quotes, I think, are really enough to give us a fuller picture of what level are these talks really working on here. And you might wonder, how can two non-diplomats work out a peace plan that 28 points, no less, that by the way, doesn't include anything for like one of the combatants in there. And the answer is they don't know how to draft any kind of a plan. So it's got a lot of points and it makes it sound like it's really important because of the number of points it has. But listen to the discussion here. All right, here's Witkoff talking to Ushakov. We put a 20-point Trump plan together that was 20 points for peace, and I'm thinking maybe we do the same thing with you, Witkoff told Ushakov, according to a recording of the conversation reviewed and transcribed by Bloomberg, right? They're talking about the Gaza 20-point plan. And by the way, what an eloquent statement of the facts. We put a 20-point Trump plan together that was 20 points for peace. It was a peace plan, you see. It was like, what? I award peace 20 points and 10 points for Slytherin. What do you mean? We put together a 20-point plan that was 20 points for peace, and I'm thinking maybe we do the same thing with you. Oh, really? That's amazing. What a great idea. Thank you for calling me. This story proves one thing. Special Envoy Witkoff talks to officials in both Russia and Ukraine nearly every day to achieve peace, which is exactly what President Trump appointed him to do. White House Communications Director Stephen Chung had to say about this. All right, well, that too means nothing. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov didn't immediately respond to comment. The conversations, for the first time, offers direct insight. The conversation offers direct insight into Witkoff's recent tactics for negotiating with Russia and what appears to be the genesis of the 28-point peace proposal that emerged earlier this month, which the U.S. has pushed Ukraine to accept as the basis of a deal. Putin said this month he believed the U.S. plan could be used as the basis for a peace settlement. He told senior officials at a meeting of the Russian Security Council that the 28-point plan had not been discussed in detail yet with the U.S., but that Moscow had received a copy of it. Trump said Tuesday he was directing Witkoff to meet with Putin in the hopes of finalizing the peace plan. Is this Trump? Yeah, posting on Truth Social saying the original 28-point peace plan, which was drafted by the United States, has been fine-tuned with additional input from both sides, and there are only a few remaining points of disagreement. At the time of the Witkoff-Ushakov call, Trump was basking in the success of his drive to end the war in Gaza. The day before, he'd become the first U.S. president to address the Israeli Knesset since 2008, after securing the release of the final 20 living hostages held by Hamas. Trump's attitude toward Putin, however, appeared to be souring. As he prepared for his meeting with Zelensky on October 17th, he was considering providing Ukraine with longer-range Tomahawk missiles, discussing fresh sanctions on Russia, not French ones, but fresh ones, and voicing his frustration with Putin. "I don't know why he continues this war," Trump said on October 14th. You're supposed to, but he doesn't. The same day that Witkoff spoke with Ushakov, he just doesn't want to end that war, and I think it's making him look very bad. Then they inserted a timeline of activities here, which I guess is somewhat interesting and important. On October 13th, Trump addresses the Knesset. The hostages are freed. The next day, Witkoff speaks to Ushakov, discussing a Putin-Trump call. 2 days later, the 16th, Trump speaks with Putin for 2.5 hours. The next day, on the 17th, Zelensky visits the White House. Then around October 24th through 26th, Witkoff meets with Dmitriev in Miami. And on October 29th, Ushakov and Dmitriev discuss Russian strategies in a call between the two of them. Now, during his call with Ushakov, Witkoff told his Russian counterpart that he had deep respect for Putin, oh no, and that he had told Trump that it was his belief that Russia has always wanted a peace deal. Also, oh no. The U.S. envoy mentioned Zelensky's upcoming visit and suggested that Putin could speak to Trump ahead of that meeting. Zelensky is coming to the White House on Friday, Witkoff said. I will go to that because they want me there, but I think it's possible we have the call with your boss before that Friday meeting, so he can derail it if he wants to. Ushakov asked Witkoff whether it would be useful for Putin to call Trump. Witkoff said it would. He also recommended that Putin congratulate Trump, oh boy, for the Gaza peace deal, say that Russia had supported it and that he respects the president as a man of peace. From that, it's going to be a really good call, Witkoff said. Yeah, again, I just sort of like, from that, it'll be really good. If you just do everything I say, everything will be really good. Here's what I think would be amazing, Witkoff then added. Maybe he says to President Trump, you know, Steve and Yuri discussed a very similar 20-point plan to peace, and that could be something that we think might move the needle a little bit. We're open to those sorts of things. So basically they said, we just declared success in Gaza. What if we use the same number of points or the same number of points for you? Then it would totally be successful because 20 is magic and it works. We don't know why, but if we announce a 20-point plan, it'll work too because 20 and 20. Even if you move it to 28, it'll probably work fine. Ushakov appeared to take some of the advice on board. Putin will congratulate and will say, Mr. Trump is a real peace man, he said. Wow. Trump and Putin held their call 2 days later at Russia's request, and the U.S. president described the 2.5-hour-long conversation as very productive. Afterward, he announced plans to meet with the Russian leader in Budapest. And I remember everybody was like, oh my God, no. A summit that is yet to take place, and also mentioned that Putin had congratulated him on the Gaza deal. Wow, what a surprise. Following up on that call, Witkoff met with Kirill Dmitriev, another senior Kremlin advisor in Miami, the sanctioned one, according to an interview that Dmitriev gave to Axios. Dmitriev told Axios he spent 3 days in Miami from October 24th. A spokesperson for Dmitriev declined to comment. On October 29th, Dmitriev and Ushakov spoke by phone in Russian. It says in Russian, not in Russia, but in Russian, and debated how strongly Moscow should push for its demands in any peace proposal, according to another recording reviewed by Bloomberg. Oh, I see. I was wondering, why do you have to tell us that they spoke in Russian? They're both Russians. Of course they spoke in Russian. But you're pointing out that you had to listen to and interpret and translate the conversation. And a transcript of this call is apparently offered as well. I assume it's this call and not just a repeat of the previous call. in which Witkoff participated. Anyway, as the two Putin aides considered various options, Ushakov argued for asking for the maximum in their submissions to the White House. He said he was concerned the U.S. might misinterpret any proposals and might take something out, but then claim there was an agreement, and that would risk the end of the negotiations, he told his colleague. They know Trump well enough to know that he sometimes does announce, we've succeeded in reaching an agreement, even though there was no agreement, and he just, takes the other side's input out of it and says, they agreed to this, it's great. Dmitriev, who also heads the Russian Direct Investment Fund, suggested sharing a paper informally and said he was confident that even if the U.S. didn't completely take Russia's version, they would at least do something very close to it. Yikes. He later assured Ushakov that he would stick to what he was told to say and that Ushakov could also discuss the paper later with Steve. Bloomberg has been unable to confirm exactly what proposals Russia shared with the U.S. and the extent to which they shaped the final 28-point blueprint. Since then, however, Ukraine has come under severe pressure to accept the proposal that Witkoff drafted with the help of his Kremlin counterparts. U.S. officials had threatened to shut off critical intelligence support to the Ukrainian military if Zelensky refused to accept the proposal, although Kyiv has since won some concessions and persuaded the U.S. to slow down following talks with Secretary of State Marco Rubio on Sunday. Under the terms first proposed by the U.S. earlier this month, Ukraine would have to withdraw troops from part of the eastern Donbas region that Russia has failed to capture through military force. Just surrender it. The area would become a neutral, demilitarized buffer zone, internationally recognized, though, as Russian. So, more Russian buffer zone. What does Russia need a buffer zone for? The one that's getting invaded here is Ukraine. Moscow would also obtain de facto recognition of Russian claims to the regions of Crimea, Luhansk, and Donetsk. Most of the remainder of the front line, including in Kherson and, I gotta do another pronunciation, Zaporizhzhia, would be effectively frozen. Ukraine and its European allies have insisted that the war should cease along current lines. Those are some of the conditions that Witkoff and Ushakov appear to preview during their call last month. And now more quotes. Me to you, I know what it's going to take to get a peace deal done, Witkoff said. Donetsk and maybe a land swap somewhere, but I'm saying instead of talking like that, let's talk more hopefully, because I think we're going to get a deal done here. What? The president will give me a lot of space and discretion to get to the deal, he added. So if we can create that opportunity that after this I talked to Yuri and we had a conversation, I think that could lead to big stuff. Okay, Ushakov replied. That sounds good. That's it. That's the only substance Bloomberg found compelling enough to quote from this transcript of their call. Now I'm actually kind of interested in maybe skimming through the transcript and seeing if there's anything even dumber in there. I'm just curious. But anyway, this really, I think, has helped me understand just what a travesty this thing is. And I don't know, maybe it'll be helpful in understanding it as it finally plays out probably next week. Guess what? Okay, so I found access to the phone call transcript, and it's not that long, and it is about as dumb as you thought. It actually got smartened up, I think, in the Bloomberg piece. Here's the whole transcript. Phone rings, run ringy dingy, two ringy dingies. Anybody know how to count in Russian? All right. Steve Witkoff starts off the conversation. Hi, Yuri. Yeah, Steve, hi. How are you? Good, Yuri. How are you doing? I am okay. Congratulations, my friend. I don't know if his accent is really that thick. Who knows? Thank you. You made a great job. Just a great job. This is in the wake of Gaza, supposedly. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, Yuri, and thanks for your support. I know your country supported it, and I thank you. I don't know if they really did. Yes. Yes, that's why we suspend the organization of First Russian-Arabic Summit. I'm not, by the way, dropping articles from his sentence. This is verbatim. Yes. Yeah, because we think you are making the real job there in the region. Well, listen, I am going to tell you something. I think if we can get the Russia-Ukraine thing solved, everybody will be jumping for joy. Yeah, no effing crap. They will. But can you? I mean, yeah. You need to solve only one problem. He laughs and says, what? Russian-Ukrainian war. I know. How do we get that solved? Oh, my God. What? My friend, I just want your advice. Do you think that it will be useful if our bosses will talk on the phone? Yes, I do. You do. And when you think it could be possible? I think as soon as you suggest. My guy is ready to do it. Okay. Yuri, here's what I would do. My recommendation? Yes, please. I would make the call and just reiterate that you congratulate the president on this achievement, that you supported it, that you respect, that he is a man of peace, and you're just really glad to have seen it happen. So I would say that. I think from that, it's going to be a really good call. Because let me tell you what I told the president. I told the president that the Russian Federation has always wanted a peace deal. That's my belief. I told the president I believe that. And I believe the issue is that we have two nations that are having a hard time coming to a compromise. And when we do, we're going to have a peace deal. I'm even thinking that maybe we set out like a 20-point peace proposal, like we just did in Gaza. We put a 20-point Trump plan together that was 20 points for peace, and I'm thinking maybe we do the same thing for you. My point is this, and now Yuri interrupts. Okay, my friend. I think that very point our leaders could discuss. Hey, Steve, I agree with you that he will congratulate. He will say that Mr. Trump is a real peace man and so. That he will say. But here's what I think would be amazing. Okay. What if, hear me out. He actually says that. Hear me out. I will discuss with my boss and come back to you, okay? Yeah. Well, he didn't hear him out. Yeah, because listen to what I'm saying. I just want you to say, maybe just to say this to President Putin, because I have the deepest respect for President Putin. Yes. Maybe he says to President Trump, Steve and Yuri discussed a very similar 20-point plan to peace, and that could be something that we think might move the needle a little bit. We're open to those sorts of things, to explore what it's going to take to get a peace deal done. Now, me to you, I know what it's going to take to get a peace deal done. Donetsk and maybe a land swap somewhere. Thanks for being exhaustive about it, by the way. But I'm saying instead of talking like that, let's talk more hopefully, because I think we're going to get a deal here. And I think, Yuri, the president will give me a lot of space and discretion to get the deal. And by the way, just to stop, it sounds like Witkoff is saying, I know what it'll take to get a deal done. A land swap and giving up Ukrainian territory to Russia, but they're probably not going to want to do that. So I'm just saying, instead of talking about that, let's talk about more hopeful stuff, because I think we can get a deal here. I don't know how, but I think we can get it. And I think the president will give me a lot of space and discretion to get that deal. But in reality, it turns out that the space and discretion was all for naught, because Witkoff comes to the president with a deal that is, in fact, Donetsk and the land swap. So I don't know why he's talking about, let's not talk about that. Let's talk about something else, when in fact he does intend to propose that. I know he intended to propose it because the Russians gave him a list and he just read it to Trump. All right. So anyway, he's saying, I think the president will give me a lot of space and discretion to get the deal. I see. So if we can create that opportunity that after this, I talked to Yuri and we had a conversation, I think that could lead to big stuff. Okay, that sounds good. Sounds good. And here's one more thing. Zelensky is coming to the White House on Friday. I know that, says he chuckles. I will go to that meeting because they want me there. But I think it's possible that, if possible, that we have the call with your boss before that Friday meeting. Before? Before, yeah? Correct. Okay, I got your advice. So I discuss that with my boss, and then I come back to you, okay? Okay, Yuri, I'll speak to you soon. Great. Thank you so much. Thanks you. It says thanks you. Bye-bye. Bye. Call ends. That's the whole friggin' thing. We got geniuses running everything. He's so smart. He totally outwitted Yuri. Okay, I will tell boss. Okay, enough, smart guy. I hear already you are talking too many times. And then, wait a minute, hear me out. If we put some points in the thing, that's it. We get peace. Like we're never going to get this, which is fine. Honestly, I don't want them brokering this peace, but I looked at the transcript. I was curious. I thought I was going to skip it. I thought it would be more serious than this. When I saw how stupid it was, I felt like I had to read it to you. All right. Well, that will just about wrap it up for the time that we have today. We only have 2 hours, set aside for Friday. I wanted to squeeze in one more mention of a quick story just to fill out the space, I guess. Really, an AP story from the other day. The Justice Department quietly replaced, quote, identical Trump signatures on recent pardons. I thought you might find this interesting. Just to get to it quick, the Justice Department apparently posted pardons online bearing identical copies of President Donald Trump's signature before quietly correcting them later on the week afterwards in what the agency called a technical error. The replacements came after online commenters seized on striking similarities in the president's signature across a series of pardons dated November 7th, including those granted to former New York Mets player Darryl Strawberry, former Tennessee House Speaker Glenn Casada, and former New York Police Sergeant Michael McMahon. In fact, the signatures on several pardons initially uploaded to the Justice Department's website were identical. 2 forensic document experts confirmed to the AP within hours of the online speculation. The administration replaced copies of the pardons with new ones that did not feature identical signatures. It insisted that Trump, who mercilessly mocked his predecessor's use of an auto pen, had originally signed all of the November 7th pardons himself and blamed technical and staffing issues for the error. Yeah, they did it.
You have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
Anyway, as the experts were saying, the basic axiom of handwriting identification science is that no 2 signatures are going to be exactly alike. But guess what? They had to stand their ground and insist that no. It was a technical glitch, but he definitely did sign all of them. And even if he didn't, it wouldn't affect the clemency anyway. So there, we'll see you next week.